September 21, 1327. Within the damp, formidable walls of Berkeley Castle, a king, recently deposed and stripped of his dignity, faced an unspeakable horror designed to leave no external trace upon his body. His final, agonizing screams, echoing through the night, were intentionally muffled by a large, heavy table, a desperate measure to silence the ultimate testament to an act of unfathomable brutality. This was not a death in battle, nor a natural passing, but a meticulously orchestrated termination, a grim ceremony of power, brutally wrested and fear profoundly instilled. The chilling precision of the deed, meant to obliterate not just a life but a legacy, instead forged an indelible stain on the annals of English history, forever linked to the image of a sovereign tormented in the most intimate, devastating way imaginable. The medieval world, though accustomed to political violence, recoiled from the whispered details of Edward II's demise, a witness to a deed so heinous it seemed to defy the very concept of kingship. To understand why such a fate befell a king, even one as widely unpopular as Edward II, one must peel back the layers of a reign marked by deep-seated resentment and profound personal failings. His was a life never truly his own, burdened by the expectations of a warrior father and a court that demanded traditional displays of martial prowess and political astuteness. From his earliest days, the young Edward of Carnarvon displayed tendencies that diverged sharply from the martial ideal embodied by Edward I, his formidable father known as Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots. He preferred leisurely pursuits, intellectual company, and the companionship of particular favorites, often neglecting the rigorous training and strategic thinking expected of a future monarch. This divergence, while seemingly innocuous in a private citizen, became a profound liability in a prince destined to inherit a fiercely hierarchical and politically volatile realm, setting the stage for future conflict and his ultimate sacrifice upon the altar of political expediency. The seeds of his tragic end were sown long before his coronation, in the very temperament and choices that defined him as a young man. Edward I, a king forged in campaigns and conquests, reportedly despaired over his son's perceived effeminacy and his increasingly obvious devotion to male companions, particularly Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of dazzling charm and wit. This affection, whether platonic or intimate, transcended the bounds of conventional royal favor, provoking deep suspicion and outrage amongst the entrenched English baronage. The king's inability to grasp the profound political consequences of such attachments, his persistent elevation of individuals deemed unworthy by the established aristocracy, would become a recurring motif throughout his reign, a destructive pattern that inexorably led him towards his horrifying end. The crown, intended as a symbol of authority and stability, instead became a crucible of torment for a man ill-suited to its crushing weight, tragically illustrating the fragility of power in the face of entrenched opposition and personal predilection. His story serves as a haunting reminder that even the most exalted positions offer no shield against the brutal machinations of desperate men. Upon his father's death in 1307, Edward II's ascension to the throne immediately heralded a radical shift in royal policy, shocking and alienating the powerful nobility whose support was crucial for stable governance. The first act of his reign was not to consolidate power through traditional alliances or military displays, but to recall Piers Gaveston from exile, bestowing upon him an unprecedented torrent of titles, lands, and privileges, including the earldom of Cornwall. This seemingly personal decision was a devastating political misstep, as the barons viewed Gaveston, an outsider, with contempt and jealousy, seeing his elevation as a direct insult to their lineage and their rightful place within the kingdom's hierarchy. The young king's profound devotion to Gaveston, a bond that surpassed mere friendship in its intensity and public display, became a lightning rod for discontent, fostering an environment where resentment festered and conspiracies began to take root. This was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of Edward's inherent inability to separate his personal affections from the arduous responsibilities of kingship, a fatal flaw that would repeatedly expose him to manipulation and ultimately to his doom. The English aristocracy, a rigid and proud class, viewed Gaveston's influence with a mixture of outrage and profound fear, perceiving him as a corrupting presence who monopolized the king's ear and squandered royal resources. Gaveston's arrogant demeanor and sharp wit, often employed to mock the powerful earls with insulting nicknames, only exacerbated the tensions, transforming simmering discontent into open hostility. The magnates, led by figures like Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the king's cousin and the wealthiest man in England, demanded Gaveston's banishment, a demand that Edward stubbornly resisted, clinging to his favorite with an almost desperate tenacity. Each forced exile and subsequent recall of Gaveston served only to highlight the king's weakness and his dangerous preference for personal loyalty over political stability, eroding any semblance of respect or authority he might have commanded. The cycle of confrontation and reluctant concession further destabilized the realm, demonstrating how deeply Edward's personal choices impacted the entire fabric of the kingdom, leading to a profound erosion of trust between monarch and magnates, a foundational pillar of medieval rule. The growing crisis culminated in the Ordinances of 1311, a sweeping set of reforms imposed upon the king by a committee of barons and bishops known as the Lords Ordainers. These ordinances sought to curb royal power, assert baronial control over key appointments, and, crucially, demand the permanent exile of Piers Gaveston. Edward, under duress, agreed to these terms, but his subsequent actions demonstrated his unwavering resolve to circumvent them, repeatedly bringing Gaveston back to England. This defiance was met with escalating baronial wrath, transforming the political struggle into a bitter, personal feud. The barons, convinced that only the removal of Gaveston could restore order and protect their interests, took increasingly drastic measures. The situation was spiraling out of control, fueled by a king's stubborn affection and a nobility's unyielding determination to assert its ancient rights, pushing the kingdom to the brink of civil war. The public, witnessing the constant turmoil, began to question the very legitimacy of a crown so deeply entangled in scandalous personal attachments, preparing the ground for the eventual outrage that would greet future developments. The relentless cycle of banishment and recall concerning Piers Gaveston reached its grim crescendo in 1312. Following yet another illicit return to England, Gaveston found himself cornered by the vengeful barons. Captured at Scarborough Castle, he was initially promised safe conduct under the protection of the Earl of Pembroke. However, this assurance proved fleeting, a cruel deception designed to lull him into a false sense of security. Intercepted by the Earl of Warwick, a man known as the Black Dog of Arden for his fierce disposition, Gaveston was taken to Warwick Castle and subsequently to Blacklow Hill. There, without the semblance of a trial, he was summarily executed, beheaded by two Welshmen with swords, an act of naked, brutal justice carried out by powerful magnates who believed they were acting in the best interests of the realm. This was not justice in the eyes of the king, but a cold-blooded murder, a profound act of defiance against his royal authority, and a personal betrayal that plunged Edward into an abyss of grief and a burning desire for retribution. The news of Gaveston's death devastated Edward II, transforming his profound attachment into an enduring obsession for vengeance against those responsible for his favorite's brutal sacrifice. This single, bloody event irrevocably fractured the fragile peace of the kingdom, setting the stage for years of bitter civil strife. The king, consumed by his loss, sought to consolidate his power and crush the rebellious barons, perceiving their actions as an affront not just to his personal affections, but to the sacred institution of monarchy itself. He rallied support, particularly from those who abhorred the baronial usurpation of royal authority, and began to lay the groundwork for a counteroffensive. Yet, his tactical weaknesses and his continued reliance on personal favorites, rather than building broad political consensus, would continue to undermine his efforts to restore order and establish firm control over his recalcitrant realm. For a period, a precarious truce held, with the barons and the king maneuvering for strategic advantage. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, however, dealt a catastrophic blow to Edward's prestige and military standing. His ill-conceived campaign against the Scots resulted in a crushing defeat, annihilating a vast English army and securing Scottish independence. This military disaster further weakened Edward's authority, emboldening his baronial opponents and allowing Thomas of Lancaster to effectively seize control of the government for a time. The failure at Bannockburn was more than a lost battle. It was a profound humiliation for a king whose primary duty was to protect his kingdom, exposing his ineptitude as a military leader and a sovereign. The public witnessed their king's inability to deliver victory, fostering a sense of disillusionment that would eventually lead to a more profound questioning of his fitness to rule. The nation began to collectively recoil from the consequences of Edward's flawed leadership, laying the groundwork for his ultimate downfall. Despite the profound humiliation of Bannockburn and the seemingly unshakable power of Thomas of Lancaster, Edward II's resilience, or perhaps his stubborn refusal to learn from past mistakes, led him to another fateful attachment. As Lancaster's influence waned due to his own administrative failures and inability to govern effectively, a new faction rose to prominence around the king: the Despensers, Hugh the Elder and Hugh the Younger. This father and son duo quickly supplanted Gaveston in the king's favor, exceeding him in their ambition, avarice, and rapaciousness. Hugh Despenser the Younger, in particular, became the king's new, inseparable companion, showered with royal patronage, lands, and titles, mirroring the earlier devastating pattern that had led to Gaveston's brutal end. The cycle of favoritism, of a king entrusting excessive power and wealth to an unworthy few at the expense of the established nobility, was repeating itself with an even more dangerous intensity. The Despensers, driven by an insatiable hunger for land and influence, manipulated the king's affections to amass vast estates and consolidate their power, often through illicit and coercive means. Their ruthless expansion of holdings, particularly in the Welsh marches, directly encroached upon the territories and rights of other powerful lords, sparking a widespread revolt. This land hunger, far more systematic and pervasive than Gaveston's personal affronts, united many of the alienated barons against the king and his new favorites. The simmering resentment boiled over into open warfare, with the Marches lords, led by figures like Roger Mortimer, rising in defiance of the Despensers' tyranny. The kingdom, already reeling from years of instability, was once again plunged into a brutal civil conflict, a testament to the devastating consequences of a king who persistently prioritized personal attachments over the welfare of his realm. Edward, fully committed to his new favorites, stood by the Despensers, granting them extraordinary legal and military support, further alienating a nobility already at breaking point. The brutality of the subsequent conflict, known as the Despenser War, saw widespread destruction and the summary execution of many of the rebellious barons. In 1322, the king achieved a decisive victory over Thomas of Lancaster at the Battle of Boroughbridge. Lancaster, the once mighty leader of the baronial opposition, was captured and swiftly executed at Pontefract Castle, mimicking the fate he had orchestrated for Gaveston 10 years earlier. This act, though it temporarily solidified Edward's power and eliminated his most formidable internal adversary, was not a symbol of justice, but a chilling warning. It demonstrated the king's willingness to resort to extreme measures against his own magnates, effectively crushing dissent but sowing seeds of an even deeper, more profound hatred within the hearts of the surviving nobility and, crucially, within the heart of his neglected queen. The memory of Lancaster's execution, a stark inversion of Gaveston's, would linger like a haunting specter over Edward's own grim fate. Amidst the escalating political turmoil and the king's deepening obsession with the Despensers, Queen Isabella, a daughter of the powerful French King Philip IV, found herself increasingly marginalized and abused. Married to Edward at the tender age of 12, she had initially endeavored to play her traditional role, bearing him children and striving for peace between her husband and the barons. However, her position became untenable as the Despensers consolidated their power, treating her with open contempt, depriving her of her dower lands, and even separating her from her own children. This systematic humiliation, endured by a queen who was herself a symbol of international alliance, fueled a simmering rage that would eventually ignite a devastating firestorm of retribution against her husband and his despised favorites. Isabella's journey was one from youthful innocence and hopeful alliance to profound personal suffering, and, ultimately, to a ruthless determination for self-preservation and revenge. The breaking point came when Isabella was dispatched to France in 1325 to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV, over the disputed territory of Gascony. This diplomatic mission, intended as a brief absence, transformed into a strategic opportunity for the neglected queen. In Paris, Isabella encountered Roger Mortimer, one of the powerful marcher lords who had been exiled to France after the Despencer War and who had narrowly escaped execution at Edward's hand. Mortimer, a charismatic and ambitious man, quickly became Isabella's confidant, and soon her lover. Their alliance, forged from shared grievances against Edward and the Despensers, evolved into a formidable conspiracy aimed at the king's overthrow. The historical record suggests a powerful bond, born of political necessity and personal affection, uniting two individuals consumed by a desire to bring down a tyrannical regime and exact a bitter revenge. Isabella's refusal to return to England, ostensibly because she would not live with the Despensers, became a public declaration of defiance against her husband's rule. She gathered an impressive array of disaffected English exiles and foreign mercenaries, using her formidable royal connections and the French court as a base of operations. The spectacle of a queen raising an army against her own husband was unprecedented, shocking European courts and drawing widespread condemnation from those who upheld the sanctity of kingship. Yet the deep unpopularity of Edward and the sheer avarice of the Despensers meant that many, both in England and abroad, secretly sympathized with Isabella's desperate plight. Her public statements, painting herself as a wronged wife and a champion against tyranny, skillfully swayed public opinion. Her actions, born of extreme desperation and a deep-seated need for justice, were building towards an inevitable, devastating confrontation that would tear the very fabric of English monarchy apart, a stark testament to the failure of systems to protect the vulnerable. On September 24, 1326, Isabella and Roger Mortimer launched their invasion of England, landing at Harwich with a relatively small force, but armed with the powerful moral legitimacy of a wronged queen and the backing of discontented magnates. The rapidity with which their rebellion gained momentum was astonishing, a testament to the profound unpopularity of Edward II and the universal hatred for the Despensers. The king, isolated and devoid of genuine support, found himself abandoned by his former allies and even by his own household. The common people, weary of years of instability and the tyranny of the Despensers, flocked to Isabella's banner, seeing her as a liberator. This was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of a kingdom's collective sigh of relief, a deeply ingrained desire for justice against those who had wielded power with such brutal disregard for the welfare of the realm. As Isabella and Mortimer advanced, Edward II's position became increasingly desperate. He fled London, abandoning his capital, accompanied only by the Despensers and a dwindling circle of loyalists. His frantic flight south and west, a humiliating spectacle for a reigning monarch, revealed the utter collapse of his authority and the complete erosion of his support base. The contrast between the formidable warrior king, Edward I, and his son, now a pathetic fugitive, could not have been starker. The system meant to protect him had become his executioner, metaphorically, as the very pillars of his power crumbled under the weight of his own misgovernance and the relentless machinations of his enemies. He was a king without a kingdom, a sovereign without subjects willing to fight for his cause. The Despensers, the objects of such intense public animosity, met swift and brutal ends. Hugh the Elder was captured first and executed at Bristol, hung, drawn, and quartered, a grim warning of the fate awaiting his son. Shortly thereafter, Hugh the Younger was apprehended alongside Edward II in South Wales. His execution at Hereford in November 1326 was a particularly gruesome spectacle, a public ceremony of vengeance orchestrated by Isabella and Mortimer. He was drawn, hung on a gallows 50 feet high, and then castrated, disemboweled, and quartered, his body parts dispatched to various towns as a chilling deterrent. This public display of brutality, though legally sanctioned by the triumphant rebels, underscored the depths of hatred Edward's favorites had provoked. The swift and merciless retribution against the Despensers provided a grim satisfaction to the populace. Yet it also foreshadowed the chilling lack of mercy that awaited the defeated king himself. The sheer ferocity of their demise served as a visceral testament to the profound outrage they had ignited within the collective consciousness of the realm. With his favorites brutally dispatched, Edward II was captured and brought back to England, a prisoner in his own kingdom. The question of his fate, however, posed a profound dilemma for Isabella and Mortimer. To execute a crowned and anointed king was an act of regicide, an almost unthinkable transgression in medieval society, one that could set a dangerous precedent and invite divine retribution. Yet, to allow him to live posed an unacceptable risk, as any surviving king, however disgraced, could become a rallying point for future rebellion. A powerful resolution was needed, one that would legitimize the transfer of power without overtly challenging the sanctity of kingship itself. The solution they devised was unprecedented: a forced abdication, carefully framed as Edward's own willing resignation for the good of the realm. In January 1327, a parliament was convened at Westminster, filled with Isabella and Mortimer's supporters. Edward II was coerced into abdicating his throne in favor of his 15-year-old son, Edward III. This was presented as a voluntary act, though the stark reality of his imprisonment and the very tangible threats against him made it anything but. Chroniclers describe a scene of profound humiliation, with Edward II weeping as he formally renounced his crown, ostensibly for his own perceived failings and the well-being of his people. The act was a careful piece of political theater, designed to lend a veneer of legality to a coup d'état, attempting to obscure the raw power that had been violently seized. The kingdom had witnessed its anointed sovereign stripped of his sacred office, a shocking spectacle that reverberated through the very foundations of medieval European monarchy, proving that even a king could be sacrificed. Following his deposition, the former king was moved from castle to castle, a shadow of his former self, increasingly isolated and vulnerable. He was first held at Kenilworth Castle, under the relatively lenient guard of Henry of Lancaster. But as the political climate shifted and whispers of potential rescue attempts grew louder, his captivity became harsher. He was eventually transferred to the grim and isolated Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, under the custody of Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers, men known for their loyalty to Mortimer. His treatment there was increasingly severe, designed to break his spirit and ensure his complete incapacitation. This period of his life, a slow descent into physical and psychological torment, served to diminish him further, reducing a former monarch to a pitiable figure, seemingly forgotten by a world that had moved on. Yet, his mere existence, however diminished, remained a profound threat to the new regime, leading inevitably to the final, haunting conclusion of his tragic reign. His continued presence was a silent question, waiting for the definitive answer. The new regime, headed by the Regency Council but dominated by Isabella and Mortimer, found its authority perpetually undermined by the mere existence of the deposed king. Despite his public abdication, rumors persisted of loyalists plotting his rescue, and the threat of a potential counter-coup loomed large. His continued survival was a destabilizing force, a silent rebuke to the legitimacy of the young Edward III's reign and the power Isabella and Mortimer now wielded. The perceived necessity of his permanent removal intensified with each passing month, pushing the conspirators towards a terrible final solution. This was not merely about political expediency. It was about fear, the profound, visceral fear that Edward II, alive, could still ignite a popular uprising or attract foreign intervention. The weight of this threat, imagined or real, pressed down upon those who had dared to depose an anointed king. The precise circumstances leading to Edward II's death remain shrouded in a deliberate historical ambiguity, a testament to the chilling secrecy surrounding the event. What is widely accepted through contemporary accounts and later historical analysis points to a highly orchestrated assassination at Berkeley Castle. On the night of September 21st, 1327, Edward II was reportedly subjected to an unspeakable act of brutality. Accounts suggest that he was forcibly pinned down, and a horn, or possibly a heated metal spit, was inserted into his anus, through which a red-hot poker was thrust deep into his bowels. This unspeakably cruel method was chosen with a specific, calculated intent to cause internal damage without leaving any external marks on his body. The intention was to make his death appear natural, or at least unprovoked by external violence, thus shielding the perpetrators from the immediate accusation of regicide and the spiritual damnation it entailed. The horror of this act is almost unimaginable, a grotesque inversion of the sacred anointing that once marked him as God's chosen. The agonizing screams that reportedly erupted from the king, piercing the night, were muffled by heavy featherbeds, a table, or blankets, stifling the final testimony of his torment. Those outside the castle walls claimed to have heard terrible cries emanating from within, a haunting witness to the extreme suffering inflicted upon the former monarch. The cold deliberation of the act, the methodical application of such a devastating instrument of pain, underscores the extreme lengths to which Isabella and Mortimer were willing to go to secure their power. The official story of his death was a plausible illness, but the whispered truth, circulated almost immediately through hushed and horrified chronicles, pointed to a deliberate, unspeakably cruel murder. The sheer barbarity of the method was meant to be a warning, a final, chilling statement from those who had dared to seize the ultimate power. The gruesome details of Edward II's death, whispered in hushed tones across Europe, sent shockwaves through the royal houses and noble courts, forever staining the reputations of Isabella and Roger Mortimer. Despite their carefully constructed narrative of natural death, the public, having witnessed the tumultuous events of the preceding years, intuitively understood the true nature of the tragedy. The lack of external marks on the body, far from convincing, only fueled speculation and deepened the sense of outrage that such a monstrous act could be committed against an anointed king, even a deposed one. The very act of attempting to conceal the violence only highlighted its chilling premeditation, transforming the event into a haunting specter that would plague the consciences of those involved for years to come. The collective memory of this sacrifice, however ignoble its recipient, became a powerful and enduring testament to the extreme ruthlessness of political power. The immediate aftermath saw Isabella and Mortimer continue their rule, attempting to stabilize the kingdom under the young Edward III. However, their grip on power was tenuous, built upon a foundation of violence and deceit. The widespread disapproval of Mortimer's blatant self-enrichment and Isabella's public relationship with him soon led to growing discontent amongst the very nobility who had supported their invasion. The execution of a king, even one as unpopular as Edward II, violated a sacred principle of medieval governance, creating a pervasive unease that undermined their authority. The moral inversion inherent in the act that justice had not been served, but rather a profound fear had been instilled began to turn public opinion against them, proving the ultimate fragility of ill-gotten power. The ghosts of past misdeeds, particularly the screams from Berkeley Castle, seemed to pursue them relentlessly. The young Edward III, though initially a pawn in his mother's and Mortimer's game, was a sharp and ambitious prince. As he matured, he grew increasingly resentful of their tyrannical regency and the dark cloud that hung over his father's demise. He was raised amidst the whispered accusations and the unspoken knowledge of the violence committed against his own father, a trauma that would undoubtedly shape his own approach to kingship. In 1330, at the age of 17, Edward III orchestrated his own coup d'état, surprising Isabella and Mortimer at Nottingham Castle. Mortimer was swiftly apprehended, tried for treason, and executed at Tyburn, hanged, drawn, and quartered, meeting a fate not dissimilar to those he had condemned. Isabella, his mother, was spared execution but forced into a lifelong retirement at Castle Rising, where she lived under virtual house arrest, a powerful queen reduced to a solitary figure, forever haunted by the shadow of her past actions. The brutal death of Edward II and the subsequent downfall of Isabella and Mortimer served as a potent, if horrifying, lesson on the extreme limits of royal power and the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition. His story, marked by personal failings, political ineptitude, and ultimately an unspeakable act of state violence, continues to resonate through the centuries, a somber warning about the fragility of power and the insatiable demands of a brutal political arena. Edward II was a king who clung to ill-chosen favorites, alienated his nobility, and failed to command the respect necessary to rule effectively, leading to a long and protracted period of instability. Yet, his demise, a meticulously planned and ghastly execution, transcended mere political necessity. It entered the realm of pure, visceral horror, forever imprinting itself upon the collective consciousness. The sheer brutality of his end remains a source of enduring fascination and revulsion, making him one of history's most tragic and tormented figures. His legacy is not one of achievement or military prowess, but rather a chilling testament to the lengths to which desperate men, driven by fear and avarice, would go to secure their power and silence their enemies. The method of his death, designed to hide the crime, ironically ensured its immortality in historical memory, cementing the perception of him as a sacrifice on the altar of political expediency. We must remember that even the most powerful positions offer no true sanctuary against the machinations of those who seek to usurp control. Edward II's story stands as a haunting testament to the failure of systems to protect the vulnerable. Even when that vulnerability is embodied by a king, it prompts us to reflect on the nature of justice and revenge, on the fine line between necessary political action and unconscionable cruelty. The echoes of Edward II's final screams, even if they were stifled and silenced in the cold stone confines of Berkeley Castle, reverberate through the corridors of history, serving as a perpetual reminder of the dark undercurrents that can flow beneath the pomp and ceremony of power. His reign and his death are not just isolated historical events. They are profound illustrations of human nature at its most desperate and depraved, a chilling narrative of how personal weakness combined with systemic cruelty can lead to a devastating end. His fate embodies the concept of innocence lost, not necessarily in a moral sense for a king who made many poor choices, but in the sense of the absolute violation of a sovereign, stripping away the last vestiges of his dignity and humanity. The story of Edward II remains a hauntingly reverent reflection on the cost of power, the price of political failure, and the indelible scars left by acts of profound brutality that society, in its darkest moments, has committed. The lessons from his life and death compel us to consider the ethical boundaries of governance and the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and, in its aftermath, profound, sobering insight.